Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. The photograph arrived at our research desk without fanfare, a sepia-toned image from 1902 showing what appeared at first glance to be an unremarkable cemetery scene. The edges were frayed, corners softened by decades of handling, and a thin crack ran diagonally across the lower right quadrant. Nothing about this image initially demanded attention, which made what we discovered all the more disturbing. The cemetery itself was typical of the Edwardian era, orderly rows of headstones under a canopy of bare-branched trees, suggesting the photo was taken in late autumn or early winter. A wrought iron fence enclosed the grounds, and at the far edge stood a small stone chapel, its Gothic spire reaching toward an overcast sky. The photographer had positioned themselves on a slight rise, capturing the entirety of the modest burial ground from an elevated perspective. According to the faded inscription on the back, written in a precise hand with now fading ink, the image was captured in Millfield Cemetery on November 12, 1902, mere days after what local newspapers described as an unexpectedly early frost. The photographer, one Thomas Harrow, was apparently documenting the cemetery for the town's historical society. What makes this photograph remarkable isn't immediately obvious. In fact, most observers see nothing unusual upon first inspection. The cemetery appears empty of living visitors, just a silent field of monuments to the dead under a gray sky. However, when examined under proper magnification, something impossible emerges. Every grave in the photograph shows subtle movement. Not the dramatic upheaval of earth that fiction might suggest, but something far more unsettling in its subtlety. Beside each headstone, the ground appears slightly disturbed, small mounds of freshly turned soil that couldn't have been created by groundskeepers or animals. More disturbing still are the faint impressions in the frost-covered grass, impressions that form partial handprints, as if something were pressing up from below. The most compelling detail appears near the cemetery's center, where a recently dug grave, still sporting funeral flowers, shows what appears to be fingers emerging just barely above the soil line. Not decomposed or skeletal, but with the unmistakable smoothness of living flesh. Thomas Harrow himself never mentioned these anomalies in his journal entries following the photograph's development. In fact, he wrote only that the cemetery seemed peculiarly still that day, with an absence of even the usual birds and small creatures one might expect. He noted feeling an uncommon chill that penetrated his heavy coat, despite the thermometer reading being not particularly severe. 3 days after taking this photograph, Thomas Harrow vanished from Millfield without explanation. His camera equipment was found neatly arranged in his studio, this image among those in his development tray. What force could animate an entire cemetery's worth of graves in such a synchronized yet subtle fashion? What drew Thomas Harrow to this location on that particular November day? And perhaps most disturbingly, what happened to him after he captured something that perhaps was never meant to be seen? Our curiosity about the Millfield Cemetery photograph led us to the town's historical archives, where we discovered unsettling correlations that Thomas Harrow couldn't have known when he captured his final image. Millfield had been founded in 1834 as a mining community, built atop what local indigenous peoples had reportedly called the Breathing Land. Early settlers dismissed these warnings as superstition. The cemetery itself was established in 1867 after a mining collapse claimed 47 lives, too many to transport to neighboring towns for burial. What caught our attention was a meteorological anomaly recorded in November 1902. For 3 consecutive nights before Harrow's photograph, the town experienced what locals called the humming frost, a peculiar phenomenon where the frozen ground emitted a low, barely perceptible vibration. Town records show 7 residents complained of hearing singing from beneath the soil. More disturbing still was our discovery of a partially damaged journal belonging to Eliza Croft, the cemetery caretaker's daughter. Her entry, dated November 10th, 2 days before Harrow's visit, described something extraordinary. Father forbids me from speaking of what happens at dusk in the cemetery. He says acknowledging it might encourage it. But tonight I watched from my window as the frost formed strange patterns above each grave. not the random crystalline structures of ordinary ice, but deliberate whorls that resembled fingerprints pressed against glass. The ground itself seemed to rise and fall, as if the entire cemetery were breathing in shallow gasps. Cross-referencing town death records revealed another pattern. In the weeks preceding November 12, 1902, Millfield experienced no deaths, the longest period without a burial in the town's history. This death drought, as the local newspaper obliquely referenced it, ended dramatically the day after Harrow's disappearance, when 11 residents died in their sleep, all reportedly found with expressions of terror and fingernails broken from clawing at their bedroom floors. We managed to track down Harrow's camera, a Kodak bullseye model popular among professionals of that era. Forensic analysis of the equipment revealed microscopic particles embedded in the lens housing. Soil mixed with traces of human tissue, as if someone had handled the camera with hands caked in cemetery earth. Perhaps most chilling was our interview with Mary Ann Phelps, now 104 years old, and the last living resident who was present in Millfield during that November. When shown Harrow's photograph, she refused to look directly at it, instead telling us, "My grandmother warned us children never to walk on graves, not because it was disrespectful to the dead, but because it might wake them." That November, something woke them anyway. The ground in Millfield has always been thin, too thin to properly separate the living from those who still remember breathing. The rational explanation would point to underground gas pockets, soil subsidence, or simple camera defects. Yet none of these account for the precision of the disturbances, each one centered exactly where a body would lie, nor the consistent pattern of upward movement evident in the photograph. What emerged from below Millfield Cemetery that November day? And why, after capturing this evidence, did Thomas Harrow join the ranks of the missing rather than the dead? Our investigation of the Millfield Cemetery photograph took an unexpected turn when we received correspondence from a Professor Amelia Blackburn of Massachusetts Historical Society. She claimed to possess something we would find most illuminating: Thomas Harrow's personal journal, recovered from a private collection in 1956. The journal arrived via courier in a lead-lined box, an unusual precaution that the professor's note explained was not excessive, considering its contents. The final entries proved revealing. Harrow's normally methodical handwriting deteriorated across the pages, becoming increasingly frantic as November 12th approached. Something calls me to the cemetery daily now. I resist, yet find myself walking there regardless of my intentions. The photographic plates I exposed yesterday revealed nothing unusual, yet when I close my eyes, I see what the camera cannot: movement beneath every stone, a synchronous shifting like the chest of a sleeper about to wake. His last entry, dated the morning of his disappearance, contains a crude sketch of what appears to be a network of tunnels beneath the cemetery, with a notation that reads, "They are not escaping, they are being summoned." Our research led us to geological surveys of Millfield conducted in 1923. The surveys were commissioned after reports of walking sounds from empty rooms plagued the town for months. The surveyors discovered an extensive network of natural caverns beneath the cemetery and surrounding area, caverns that appeared to be slowly expanding upward. More disturbing was our consultation with Dr. Helena Weiss, an expert in 19th century burial practices. She identified a critical deviation in Millfield's interment protocols. While most cemeteries of that era buried their dead 6 feet deep, Millfield's unusual geology necessitated shallower graves, often merely 4 feet below the surface. A 2-foot difference might seem trivial, Dr. Weiss explained, but it placed the deceased precisely at the level where the natural limestone caverns were weakest, essentially positioning bodies along a geological fault line between worlds. Town Council minutes from December 1902, after the 11 simultaneous deaths, record a unanimous decision to close and consecrate the cemetery with additional rituals not typically associated with Christian burial grounds. These included lining the cemetery's perimeter with iron spikes driven into the ground at precise intervals, and the curious practice of pouring salt into the soil of new graves. We traced Harrow's camera's chain of custody and discovered something the previous owners had concealed. A second photograph taken that day, found undeveloped in the camera's storage compartment. When carefully processed in our darkroom, It revealed Harrow's final image, a self-portrait at the cemetery gates, his expression one of horrified recognition. Most telling is what appears behind him, a crowd of figures standing among the graves, visible only as distortions in the photographic emulsion, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Each distortion corresponds precisely with a grave location. The Millfield Town Registry contains one final note regarding Thomas Harrow. 3 years after his disappearance, during the excavation for a new road half a mile from the cemetery, workers discovered a man's boot containing partial remains. Dental records confirmed Harrow's identity, but raised one inexplicable question. How had his remains traveled through solid bedrock? The cemetery itself was abandoned after 1922 when the final caretaker, Jonathan Croft, reported that the grounds had become impossible to maintain as the earth itself refuses to lie still. Today the site remains fenced off, unmarked on modern maps. Its location remembered only by the few remaining families who still place iron tokens at their doorsteps each November 12th. After years tracing Thomas Harrow's fate, our attention shifted to those who remained in Millfield, particularly the 11 who died the night after his disappearance. Death certificates listed identical causes, cardiac arrest during sleep. Yet funeral home records told a different story. Mortician Franklin Pell's private notes, discovered in his granddaughter's attic, documented unusual post-mortem characteristics. Each victim exhibited soil embedded deeply beneath their fingernails, soil that chemical analysis proved identical to that found in Millfield Cemetery. More disturbing were the splinters recovered from their fingertips, matching the wood varieties used for coffins interred during the previous decade. The deceased show signs consistent with having clawed their way upward through earth and wood, Pell wrote, yet they died in their beds, miles from the cemetery grounds. We located photographs of these victims' homes taken during the subsequent investigation. Each bedroom floor displayed identical damage, circular patterns of scratches radiating outward as if something had pushed up from below, then retreated. The town's physician, Dr. Samuel Garrity, conducted autopsies despite community objections. His findings, sealed by court order until 1978, described internal anomalies inconsistent with natural development. Each victim's lungs contained microscopic fragments of burial shrouds, not their own, but those belonging to Millfield's long-interred dead. We tracked down Eleanor Weir, great-granddaughter of Millfield's Reverend. She shared family documents revealing the church's response to the tragedy. 3 days after the deaths, 23 clergymen from surrounding parishes gathered to perform what they called the closing, a ritual absent from orthodox religious texts. They didn't exorcise the cemetery, Eleanor explained, showing us her ancestor's diary. They negotiated with it. The diary described how the clergymen arranged themselves in a precise geometric pattern throughout the cemetery, each reading different religious texts simultaneously at midnight. The Reverend wrote, "We acknowledge now what the indigenous people understood. This ground is a doorway, and sometimes doors swing both ways. Most revealing was our discovery of town planning documents from 1873. The original cemetery blueprint showed something unusual. A central plot left deliberately vacant, marked with a notation in Latin, ostium nec aperiendum, the door not to be opened. This central plot appeared in Harrow's photograph as an unmarked patch of ground, the precise location where he captured the image of fingers emerging from the soil. Soil samples taken from this location in 1954 during a forgotten academic study revealed chemical compositions matching no known geological profile in North America. The samples disappeared from university storage 3 days after analysis, along with the researcher who documented them. We consulted Professor Martin Keene, an expert in comparative mythology, who identified Millfield's phenomena as consistent with what ancient cultures called thin places, locations where the boundary between worlds diminishes during certain astronomical alignments. What's remarkable about Millfield, Keene noted, is that this thinning appears to have been artificially triggered rather than naturally occurring. The astronomical record shows that November 12, 1902, experienced a rare planetary alignment, one that wouldn't recur for precisely 120 years. Today marks that recurrence. This morning, our monitoring equipment detected unusual seismic activity beneath the former Millfield Cemetery site. Subtle vibrations forming patterns that our computers identify as matching the rhythm of human breathing. Our findings from Millfield compelled us to visit the site personally, a decision that placed us directly in the path of whatever cosmic recurrence was unfolding. The former cemetery now lies beneath an overgrown field, officially designated as private property with no trespassing signs weathered nearly illegible. What the satellite images hadn't revealed was the perfect circle of dead vegetation spanning exactly 47 feet in diameter, matching the precise number of miners buried after the original collapse. Within this circle, the ground felt unnaturally warm despite the November chill, and our equipment detected electromagnetic anomalies that caused compasses to spin and recording devices to malfunction. We had arranged to meet Eleanor Weir's son, Michael, who reluctantly agreed to serve as our guide. A geology professor at the State University, he arrived carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment, but revealed itself as something far more specialized. "My family has monitored this site for generations," he explained, assembling a device with copper coils and vacuum tubes that seemed decidedly anachronistic. "What you're standing on isn't just a cemetery, it's a pressure valve." Michael's instrument measured what he called permeability factors, the resistance between dimensional boundaries. His readings confirmed what we had feared. The barrier was thinning rapidly, already 38% more permeable than baseline measurements taken just 1 month prior. "The indigenous people never buried their dead here," Michael said, consulting ancestral records preserved by his family. "They built structures to channel and dissipate the energy that naturally accumulated. When settlers demolished those structures to build the cemetery, they unknowingly created a capacitor for whatever exists on the other side." As twilight approached, we witnessed the first physical manifestation, frost forming on the ground in intricate patterns, despite temperatures well above freezing. The patterns resembled circuit boards or ancient glyphs, spiraling outward from the center of the dead vegetation circle. We deployed specialized audio equipment capable of detecting infrasound, vibrations below the range of human hearing. The recordings, when analyzed through frequency-shifting software, revealed something chilling. Hundreds of voices speaking in unison, repeating the same phrase in a language that predated European settlement. A linguistics expert we consulted remotely identified fragments as Proto-Algonquian, roughly translating to, "The borrowed time returns to its lender." Most disturbing was what our ground-penetrating radar revealed. The subsurface topology had changed dramatically since geological surveys conducted just 5 years ago. What had been solid bedrock had somehow become hollow, forming chamber-like spaces at regular intervals beneath where gravestones once stood. These chambers appeared interconnected by tunnel-like formations that converged at the center, the unmarked plot from Harrow's photograph. Michael confirmed our suspicions with grim resignation. The planetary alignment isn't causing the thinning, it's merely the key turning in a lock. Whatever was summoning from below in 1902 is now answering from above. As darkness fell completely, our equipment detected a harmonic resonance emanating from the soil itself, a precise match to the frequency of human brainwaves during deep dream states. The temperature continued rising as frost paradoxically spread, creating an environment of impossible contradictions. We placed seismic sensors in a grid pattern across the field and retreated to our vehicle to monitor readings. The data stream showed miniature quakes occurring at 6-second intervals, exactly the rhythm of adult human respiration. The breathing land was awakening again. And we now understood why Thomas Harrow never fled, why he instead took that final self-portrait with the distorted figures behind him, because by then, it was already too late to leave. The abrupt silence from our vehicle's monitoring equipment marked the exact moment everything changed. The screens flickered once, then died completely despite their independent power supplies. Michael's anachronistic device, however, continued functioning, its vacuum tubes glowing with increasing intensity as the copper coils emitted a high-pitched whine. "They're synchronized now," Michael whispered, his eyes fixed on the field before us. "Every chamber beneath us is vibrating at precisely the same frequency." Through night vision equipment, we observed the impossible. the entire field undulating subtly, as if the earth itself were a cloth being gently lifted from below. The dead vegetation circle at the center began to sink, not suddenly but with the deliberate pace of an inhalation. My grandfather described this, Michael said, retrieving a leather-bound journal from his pack. November 12th, 1922. Exactly 20 years after Harrow disappeared. The ground performed exactly the same movement, creating what he called the inverted dome. The journal contained detailed drawings of what happened next, the central depression continuing until it formed a perfect hemisphere descending into the earth. But what emerged from that depression in 1922 was redacted, the pages carefully excised with surgical precision. "Why didn't your grandfather share this information?" I asked. "Because after that night he physically couldn't," Michael replied, rolling up his sleeve to reveal an unusual birthmark encircling his wrist. Everyone who witnessed the event was marked somehow. They could write about the event's prelude but became physically ill when attempting to describe what followed. The mark has appeared on every firstborn in our family since. As the depression deepened before us, we noticed something peculiar about the excavated soil. There was none. The earth wasn't being displaced but rather folded somehow, as if space itself were being manipulated rather than matter. Michael's device suddenly emitted a series of rapid clicks. He checked the readings and looked up with an expression of disbelief. "The permeability is now at 100%, he said. "There's no barrier at all." From the center of the depression rose not a physical entity, but a distortion in light, similar to what appeared behind Harrow in his final photograph. The distortion expanded outward, reaching the edges of the dead vegetation circle. Our vehicle's electronics suddenly reactivated, all systems simultaneously powering up. The seismic readings had changed from regular pulses to a constant, uniform vibration across the entire field. The frequency analysis displayed a perfect match to what neurologists call binding waves, the synchronization pattern when disparate parts of a brain unify into conscious thought. "It's not separate entities," I realized aloud. "The graves, the chambers, the tunnels, they're components of a single organism, and it's fully awake now." Michael nodded grimly, retrieving from his pack what appeared to be an antique brass key. "This is why my family has remained in Millfield for 5 generations, he said. "We're not monitors, we're wardens." He stepped toward the field, key extended before him. Thomas Harrow wasn't the first photographer to capture this event. There was another, 50 years earlier, using a daguerreotype process. The images showed something crucial that Harrow missed: the lock. As Michael approached the edge of the undulating field, the distortion in the center began coalescing into a familiar shape, the unmistakable silhouette of a door standing upright within the depression, awaiting its key. The moment Michael inserted the brass key into the doorway's invisible lock, a sound unlike anything in human experience reverberated across the field. Not a noise, but rather its opposite. A vacuum of auditory sensation that pulled at our eardrums as if trying to extract something essential from within us. "Stay behind me," Michael instructed, though his voice reached us as little more than vibrations through the ground beneath our feet. The transitional phase has always been the most dangerous. The key turned not with mechanical precision, but with fluid organic resistance, like a surgeon navigating living tissue. As it completed its rotation, the doorway's silhouette solidified, no longer a distortion but a tangible threshold comprised of what appeared to be compressed cemetery soil, human bone, and material that defied categorization, neither solid nor liquid but somehow both simultaneously. From our position, we observed something that couldn't possibly exist. Through the doorway lay not the continuation of the depression below, but a vast landscape extending impossibly beyond the physical constraints of our world, a horizon of undulating forms, resembling both grave markers and human figures, stretched endlessly beneath a sky that pulsed with colors absent from our visual spectrum. "This is where Thomas Harrow went," Michael explained, maintaining his position at the threshold. "Not by choice, but by recognition." "Recognition of what?" I managed to ask, fighting against the pressure building in my skull. "That he belonged there, that all photographers of the liminal eventually do." Michael turned toward us, his expression both sorrowful and resolved. The camera doesn't just capture images, it thins reality where it focuses most intently. Harrow didn't just photograph the cemetery, he weakened the barrier through repeated exposure. The ground surrounding the doorway began extruding objects. Personal effects long buried with Millfield's dead. Pocket watches, wedding rings, faded photographs, and children's toys emerged from the soil like natural growths. Each item oriented itself toward the doorway as if magnetically drawn. "It's collecting," Michael said, consulting his family's journal, gathering the anchors that tethered the dead to our side. Most disturbing was the emergence of a familiar object. A Kodak bullseye camera, unmistakably Harrow's, rising from the earth completely intact despite decades underground. Its lens, impossibly clean, pointed directly at us. "We need to leave," I urged, but Michael shook his head. "The door must be properly closed this time. My ancestors merely delayed this moment. They lacked the complete ritual." He produced a small cloth bag from within his coat. This contains soil from every consecrated cemetery within 500 miles, gathered over decades. As Michael began sprinkling the composite soil around the doorway's perimeter, the camera levitated, suspended by unseen forces. Its shutter clicked repeatedly, each exposure accompanied by a visible thinning of reality around us, as if the very fabric of our world was being captured and removed, negative by negative. Through the viewfinder, visible even from our distance, was not the scene before us, but Thomas Harrow himself, still photographing after all these years, from the other side. The earth around us began to contract and expand in a perfect rhythm as objects continued emerging. Not just personal effects now, but scraps of clothing, fragments of coffin wood, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be preserved human tissue. These organic remnants didn't decay upon exposure to air, but instead maintained an impossible freshness, as if time had never touched them. Michael worked methodically, completing a circle of consecrated soil around the doorway. As he did, the items rising from the earth began arranging themselves in concentric patterns echoing the circle, creating a complex mandala of the dead's possessions. "Harrow's camera is the conduit," Michael explained, never pausing in his work. "In 1902, he created a permanent connection between worlds. The camera doesn't just record images, it's become a doorway itself, thinner and more portable than this one." The floating camera suddenly oriented toward the night sky, its lens aimed at the precise planetary alignment occurring above us. Through some impossible optic effect, we could see the viewfinder from where we stood. It showed not stars but faces, hundreds of them, each one bearing the same expression Thomas Harrow wore in his final self-portrait. The original indigenous rituals weren't meant to seal anything away, Michael continued, reaching the final quarter of his circle. They were designed to allow controlled communication between worlds. The settlers misunderstood and tried to block it completely, creating pressure that had to eventually rupture. As he spoke, documents began emerging from the soil. Letters, journals, and official records. Pages fluttered upward, arranging themselves in chronological spirals around the doorway. We recognized fragments of the research we'd been collecting, as if the entity beyond the threshold had been conducting its own parallel investigation into our world. "My family's responsibility isn't to prevent the door from opening," Michael said, completing the soil circle. "It's to ensure passage works in both directions." The revelation struck with chilling clarity. Michael wasn't trying to close the doorway. He was stabilizing it. The camera's shutter clicked one final time, and the sound echoed like a lock tumbling into place. Through the doorway, the undulating landscape shifted, revealing what appeared to be a perfect replica of Millfield Cemetery as it existed in 1902, except every grave stood open and empty, waiting. "The alignment creates equilibrium," Michael explained, stepping back from his completed work. "For 1 hour, passage becomes possible in both directions. Those who were taken can return, those who belong there can cross over." From within our vehicle, equipment suddenly reactivated, screens displaying readings beyond their programmed parameters. One monitor showed a cascading sequence of names, residents of Millfield who had disappeared over the decades, interspersed with photographers, researchers, and investigators who had documented the site. My own name appeared in the sequence, followed by a date, today. "You've been documenting the liminal for years," Michael said, turning to face me with an expression of perfect empathy. "Haven't you felt it calling? Haven't you known, each time you focused your lens on something beyond understanding, that you were being recognized in return?" He extended his hand, not toward the doorway, but toward Harrow's floating camera. "Some doors we open ourselves, one photograph at a time." The realization that my name appeared in the sequence sent ice through my veins, yet something deeper than fear resonated within me. Recognition. I'd spent years chasing shadows through my camera, believing I was the observer rather than the observed. "This is why the photograph found its way to you," Michael said quietly. "Items from beyond have their own gravity, pulling toward those who already belong partially to the other side." Behind him, the doorway pulsed with increasing luminosity. The landscape beyond was transforming. Millfield Cemetery's empty graves were filling, not with bodies rising up, but with figures descending down into them, like reversed film of emergence. "They're returning," I whispered. "Some are," Michael confirmed. "Those taken unwillingly during incorrect cycles. The alignment allows correction." A cold wind swept across the field, carrying whispers and voices too numerous to distinguish individually. Papers swirled around us, research notes, historical records, and personal journals forming a vortex of collective memory. Among them, I recognized pages from my own notebooks, somehow extracted from my locked office 20 miles away. "Your documentation of liminal spaces created anchors," Michael explained, gesturing toward the floating papers. "Each photograph, each written observation, they're breadcrumbs marking your path toward this threshold." Harrow's camera drifted closer, its ancient lens focusing and refocusing with impossible precision. Through its viewfinder, I glimpsed not myself as I currently stood, but as I appeared in countless self-portraits throughout my career, always half hidden behind my own camera, my face increasingly transparent with each progressive image. "I've been disappearing for years," I realized aloud. "Not disappearing," Michael corrected. "Transitioning. Few achieve it gradually enough to maintain awareness during the process." From the doorway emerged a figure I recognized immediately, despite never having seen his face clearly. Thomas Harrow, still clutching his notebook, his form simultaneously substantial and translucent. He nodded at me with the solemn recognition of a colleague. Behind him came others, the 11 who died in their sleep, researchers who had vanished over decades, and dozens more I couldn't identify. They moved with deliberate purpose toward the artifacts rising from the soil, reclaiming fragments of their former existence. "They return annually to strengthen their connections," Michael said, "to prevent complete dissolution in the space between worlds." Harrow approached, extending his hand not in greeting but offering something. A photograph I'd never seen, showing my own face as captured from the other side. In it, I appeared more substantial there than here, my features sharp against a background of perfect clarity, while my clothing and extremities faded into transparency. "The camera doesn't create images," I understood suddenly. "It creates echoes between realities." The planetary alignment reached its apex overhead as Harrow's camera floated directly between us, its shutter trembling on the verge of another exposure. The doorway's edges expanded, reaching the boundary of Michael's consecrated circle. "You have approximately 3 minutes to decide," Michael said calmly. The door remained stable only during perfect alignment. Harrow nodded in confirmation, his expression neither encouraging nor warning, simply acknowledging the choice that he himself had faced over a century before. The choice before me wasn't really a choice at all, merely the acknowledgement of a journey already undertaken. I found myself reaching for my own camera, which had materialized from my vehicle without my conscious retrieval. The familiar weight in my hands felt simultaneously like an anchor to this world and a passport to the next. "How many before me?" I asked, addressing both Michael and Harrow. "Documentarians of the liminal spaces have been crossing over since humanity first captured images," Michael answered. "The cave paintings at Lascaux weren't art, they were transition records." Harrow nodded, opening his notebook to reveal sketches of photographers throughout history. Individuals from every era who had vanished mysteriously, their final works often showing impossible perspectives or subjects that defied natural explanation. The mechanism changes, Michael continued. Cave walls, canvas, silver plates, film, digital sensors, all temporary technologies serving the same function. They're not recording devices, but thinning instruments. Around us, the returned figures continued collecting their anchors, personal items that maintained their connection to our reality. Some gathered photographs, others letters or clothing fragments. An elderly woman cradled a child's doll with such tenderness that I felt my throat tighten with emotion. They exist simultaneously in both worlds, Michael explained, following my gaze. The anchors prevent complete dissolution, allowing cyclical return during alignments. The planetary configuration overhead began shifting. We had perhaps 90 seconds remaining. Harrow's expression grew urgent as he gestured toward his floating camera, now pulsing with increasing luminosity. "The difference between you and those who disappeared suddenly," Michael said, "is preparation. Your gradual documentation created a stable transition path. Those taken abruptly experienced difficulties integrating." Harrow nodded solemnly, his partially transparent form flickering momentarily to reveal a more disturbing aspect. Tissue and bone improperly aligned, as if reassembled by something that only approximately understood human anatomy. "You would be the first to cross with complete awareness," Michael added. "Your research, combined with Harrow's century of observation from the other side, might finally complete the understanding my family has sought for generations." I raised my camera, not to capture an image, but to align its viewfinder with Harrow's floating device. Through this double lens, I saw not the doorway, but countless other thresholds throughout the world, liminal spaces where reality had grown thin through focused observation. Each one pulsed with potential, waiting for someone to recognize its true nature. "There will be others after me," I said, the realization bringing unexpected comfort. "There always are," Michael confirmed. "The in-between requires witnesses." The alignment above shifted further, 30 seconds remaining. The returned figures began moving back toward the doorway, their collected anchors clutched close. Harrow extended his hand again, not demanding, but inviting. I stepped forward, camera raised not to document, but to complete a connection spanning more than a century. Researcher to researcher, observer to observer, transition to transitioning. The moment my camera connected with Harrow's, I experienced what can only be described as bifurcation. Part of me remained rooted in the field, conscious of Michael watching with scholarly fascination, while another aspect, perhaps my truer self, stepped through the doorway with perfect clarity of purpose. The transition felt like moving between rooms in a familiar house, momentarily disorienting, yet fundamentally natural. The landscape beyond defied conventional description. It existed as a palimpsest of all versions of Millfield Cemetery throughout its history, simultaneously ancient and newborn, decayed and pristine. "We experience time differently here," Harrow explained, his voice resonating with newfound solidity, while my own physical form acquired the translucent quality I'd observed in him. "What appears as annual planetary alignments to them is our continuous present." Other photographers surrounded us, figures I recognized from disappeared expeditions, vanished war correspondents, and missing documentarians whose final images had always contained unexplainable anomalies. They greeted me not as a newcomer, but as someone finally arriving at an appointed destination. "We maintain the archive," explained a woman I recognized as Eliza Marsh, who vanished while photographing abandoned asylums in 1889. She gestured toward an impossible structure resembling both library and darkroom, extending beyond visible horizons. "Every image ever captured of the in-between exists here, including those not yet taken in your former timeline." The mechanics of this realm operated on principles that would have seemed nonsensical before my transition, but now felt self-evident. Photographs weren't static records, but permeable membranes. Each image of a liminal space created a pinhole between worlds, and those who specialized in capturing such images eventually accumulated enough of these perforations to slip through entirely. "Your research collection wasn't just documentation," Harrow said, leading me toward the archive. It was a self-administered preparation ritual. Each photo examined, each case file analyzed, they acclimated your consciousness to exist here. Inside the archive, I discovered the true nature of our work. Transitional beings like ourselves maintained the boundaries between worlds, not by sealing them, but by carefully regulating their permeability. The indigenous people understood this. Their rituals never sought to block the doorway, but to ensure controlled exchange. The cemetery was merely one access point, explained another archivist, a hollow-eyed man clutching a Civil War-era camera. There are thousands worldwide, crossroads, certain bodies of water, ancient stone formations, all requiring documentation and maintenance. Most illuminating was the revelation about our cameras. They weren't just tools, but extensions of consciousness, organs of perception evolved specifically to sense liminal boundaries. Those drawn to photography of the unexplained weren't merely documenting the transitional spaces. They were unconsciously preparing to become caretakers of those very thresholds. "Your final task awaits," Harrow said, presenting a leather-bound ledger. "Record your transition completely, then ensure it reaches those who follow. The account must always be incomplete enough to require personal investigation, yet detailed enough to guide." I understood then why Thomas Harrow's photograph had found me, not because I was meant to solve his disappearance, but because I was meant to join him in this essential work of cosmic maintenance, preserving the delicate membrane between worlds that was never meant to be impenetrable. Through the archive's endless corridors, I discovered the true purpose behind our collection of liminal photographs. They weren't merely documentation or even transition points, they were stabilization mechanisms for reality itself. Each image captured at a threshold acted as a counterweight, preventing unregulated collapse between worlds. The incident in 1902 wasn't meant to happen, Harrow explained as we examined the original Millfield photographs together. The barrier thinned too quickly because something was actively weakening it from this side. He guided me to a sealed chamber containing what appeared to be damaged photographs, images so distorted they seemed to writhe with internal movement. Unlike the organized archives elsewhere, these were contained in lead-lined boxes with elaborate locking mechanisms. Some photographers discover their ability to thin reality, but misunderstand its purpose, explained Eleanor Marsden, who had vanished while documenting abandoned lighthouses in 1937. They believe they're creating portals for entities to pass through, rather than maintaining necessary boundaries. This chamber housed the work of these misguided practitioners, individuals who had deliberately weakened barriers for personal gain or misguided communication with what lay beyond. Their photographs emanated wrongness, the images depicting not just liminal spaces, but active tiers in reality. Thomas wasn't the first photographer at Millfield, Harrow said, revealing a truth I hadn't anticipated. I was documenting someone else's interference. He opened an ancient portfolio containing daguerreotypes from 1867, the year Millfield Cemetery was established. The images showed a photographer setting up elaborate equipment around fresh graves. Notably, the equipment included unusual components, copper coils similar to those on Michael's device, and crystalline structures positioned to focus light in unnatural patterns. "Jeremiah Blackwell," Harrow said, pointing to the photographer. "He believed the miners' deaths opened a natural gateway that could be technologically enhanced. He used a modified camera to deliberately dissolve the barrier over decades." The truth crystallized with terrible clarity. Millfield Cemetery hadn't been a natural thin place until Blackwell made it one through repeated, intentional photographic manipulation. "Our role isn't just documentation or even transition," Harrow explained. "It's intervention when necessary. Some doors should remain regulated, not sealed or thrown open." The archive contained thousands of similar cases, locations worldwide where overzealous practitioners had created unstable thresholds. In each instance, photographers like us had transitioned to repair the damage, often appearing as mysterious disappearances in historical records. "The camera creates the doorway, but the photographer becomes the key," Eleanor said. "Only those who made the breach can properly heal it." I understood then why Michael's family had been caretakers rather than wardens. The weirs hadn't been preventing access, but preventing collapse. maintaining the delicate equilibrium between separation and connection that allowed both worlds to exist without consuming each other. "Your collection of shadow frames was never random," Harrow said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You were being guided toward the places that need your specific attention, thresholds damaged by those who came before you." In the distance, through the archive's impossible windows, I could see countless other transitional beings departing for their assigned locations, each carrying a camera not to capture new images, but to repair the tears created by those who had misunderstood the true purpose of liminal photography. As I prepared to depart on my first assignment, Harrow presented me with a modified camera, an elegant fusion of 19th century craftsmanship and components that defied conventional understanding. Its brass body housed not just glass lenses but crystalline structures that seemed to shift and realign themselves when viewed from different angles. "Each of us requires tools calibrated to our specific resonance," Harrow explained, demonstrating how the viewfinder revealed not just physical space but temporal layers, past, present, and possible futures simultaneously visible as overlapping transparencies. This was constructed from fragments of every camera you've ever used, assembled here where time operates differently. The device felt unnaturally warm against my hands, responding to my touch like something alive. Through its viewfinder, I could perceive the true nature of the assignment awaiting me. A remote lighthouse on Nova Scotia's eastern coast where, in 1974, an amateur photographer had inadvertently created a rupture while documenting unusual light phenomena. "The breach has been expanding slowly for decades," explained Catherine Wells, who had transitioned in 1908 after photographing spiritualist gatherings. "Local residents experience it as lost time, recurring dreams, and occasionally duplicated objects, items existing simultaneously in multiple states." The concept of traveling between worlds now seemed remarkably straightforward, not physical movement but a shift in perceptual alignment. By focusing through my calibrated camera at the precise frequency of the damaged threshold, I could essentially tune myself to its location. "You'll maintain awareness of both sides during this repair," Harrow advised, "which means you'll experience the disorientation that accompanies simultaneous existence. Some find it distressing initially." Before departure, Eleanor guided me through the archive's most sacred chamber, a perfectly circular room where the very first transition records were preserved. Cave paintings, carved tablets, and ancient scrolls depicted early humans who had recognized the thinness between worlds and developed methods to document it long before modern cameras existed. "The terminology changes across cultures and eras," she explained, "but the fundamental understanding remains consistent. Shamans, oracle priestesses, medieval mystics, many were simply early practitioners of what we now call liminal photography. They used different tools but performed identical functions. Most profound was the revelation that our work existed in service to a delicate balance. Neither side of the threshold could claim primacy or greater reality. Both worlds required the boundaries between them to remain semi-permeable rather than completely sealed or dissolved. "The lighthouse breach requires recalibration rather than closure," Catherine instructed, demonstrating specialized techniques for photographing damaged thresholds. "You'll need to capture 7 sequential images, each focused on a different temporal layer visible through the rupture. The completed sequence will establish a proper rhythm of exchange between worlds." As I prepared to focus my camera on the coordinates of the lighthouse, I felt a profound sense of purpose unlike anything from my former existence. The transitional beings around me weren't lost souls or supernatural entities, but essential caretakers maintaining cosmic infrastructure that had existed since consciousness first recognized the thinness between realities. "Remember," Harrow said as my perception began shifting toward my assignment, "you're not leaving one world for another. You're becoming what you always were, a guardian of the membrane between them." The lighthouse materialized around me, not as sudden apparition but as overlapping realities gradually aligning until one became dominant. I found myself standing in the keeper's quarters, surrounded by evidence of hasty abandonment. A half-finished cup of tea, fossilized with decades of dust. A logbook open to April 7th, 1974. A weather-worn jacket still hanging from a peg as if its owner had stepped out momentarily. Through my calibrated viewfinder, I could perceive what conventional observers could not. The lighthouse existed in multiple states simultaneously. In one layer, it stood abandoned and decaying. In another, it appeared pristine and operational. In a third, it never existed at all, the cliff face smooth and uninterrupted by human construction. Most concerning was the seventh layer, where the lighthouse had transformed into something architectural principles couldn't explain, a structure whose dimensions folded inward upon themselves, creating impossible spaces that hurt the mind to perceive. I began the calibration sequence, capturing the first image of the damaged threshold. The moment my shutter released, I felt reality shudder around me, not violently, but with the gentle correction of a clock being rewound. The lighthouse's multiple states briefly harmonized before diverging again. Moving methodically through the building, I located the exact spot where the original photographer had created the rupture, a circular window in the lantern room, positioned to frame the horizon where sea met sky. Through my viewfinder, this window didn't show the external landscape, but revealed a swirling vortex of temporal fragments, each containing versions of the lighthouse from different points in its existence. As I prepared to capture the second calibration image, something unprecedented occurred. Within the temporal vortex, a figure appeared, the lighthouse keeper from 1974, frozen in the moment of his disappearance. His expression registered neither fear nor confusion but profound recognition, as if he'd glimpsed something beyond human comprehension and understood it completely. More disturbing still, he seemed aware of my presence across the damaged threshold. His eyes tracked my movement as I positioned the camera, and his lips formed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. The light shows them where to breach. I realized with sudden clarity that the lighthouse's original purpose had never been navigation for ships. Its specific position, the unusual composition of its lens, the precise height of its tower, all had been designed to maintain a controlled illumination of the threshold between worlds. The amateur photographer hadn't created the rupture. He had merely damaged an ancient management system disguised as maritime infrastructure. The logbook confirmed my suspicion. Entries dating back to 1839 contained coded observations not of weather conditions or passing vessels, but of threshold stability measurements. The tea-drinking keeper whose final entry I'd observed hadn't abandoned his post. He'd been recruited into service on the other side when the breach became critical. As I captured the third calibration image, the keeper's frozen form began to move, reaching toward me across impossible distance with an urgency that transcended conventional communication. He wasn't warning me away, but gesturing for me to complete the sequence quickly. Something was approaching from beyond the damaged threshold, attracted by my presence as a transitional being. The lighthouse began to tremble, not from physical force, but from temporal instability, as multiple realities strained against each other like tectonic plates. I needed to complete the remaining images before the rupture expanded beyond repair, releasing whatever had been waiting for this opportunity since 1974. The lighthouse lantern room shuddered as I captured the fourth calibration image, the glass plates of the Fresnel lens vibrating at frequencies that produced harmonics just beyond human hearing. Through my specialized viewfinder, I could see temporal fractures spreading like ice crystals across the threshold, the damage accelerating rather than stabilizing. "The sequence is incorrect," came Harrow's voice, somehow reaching me across the divide. "Lighthouses require counterclockwise calibration. They spiral opposite to cemetery thresholds." I quickly adjusted my position, moving against the instinctive pattern I'd been taught in the archive. The keeper's frozen form nodded in affirmation, his hand now pointing to specific positions around the lantern room, 7 points corresponding to the phases of the moon rather than sequential numbers. As I captured the fifth image from the proper position, the lighthouse briefly synchronized across all temporal layers, existing for one perfect moment as a unified reality. In that instant, I glimpsed its true purpose through centuries, not just managing the threshold but actively communicating with whatever existed beyond it. The logbook entries suddenly made sense. What I'd mistaken for stability measurements were actually conversation fragments, a century-long dialogue between keepers and entities that resided in the space between worlds. The light itself was a language, its flash patterns a sophisticated code, maintaining diplomatic relations with intelligences fundamentally different from human consciousness. The breach hadn't been accidental. The amateur photographer from 1974 had deliberately sabotaged this communication, creating silence where there had been constant exchange. The entities beyond the threshold weren't trying to invade. They were responding to what they perceived as an act of aggression, the cosmic equivalent of a severed diplomatic hotline. As I prepared for the sixth calibration image, the keeper's form finally broke free from its temporal suspension. He stumbled forward, his physical body partially materialized in my reality while still anchored elsewhere. "They think we abandoned them," he gasped, his voice fluctuating between whisper and thunderclap as his existence stabilized. 50 years of silence after centuries of conversation. They're coming to see why we stopped answering. I understood with terrible clarity what would happen if they emerged into our world without proper translation. Like deep-sea creatures brought suddenly to the surface, both they and our reality would suffer catastrophic decompression. "The final image must restore the dialogue," the keeper explained, moving with increasing confidence as his form solidified. "Not just repair the barrier, but re-establish contact." He reached for my calibrated camera, his hands passing partially through the solid metal before finding purchase. Together, we adjusted settings that responded to his touch in ways they hadn't to mine, recognizing him as their original operator. "The light speaks for humanity," he said, positioning us for the sixth image. "Always has. Cave fires, temple flames, lighthouse beams, all the same purpose. We're not gatekeepers but translators." The beam from the lighthouse suddenly activated, cutting through temporal layers with impossible precision, projecting not onto the horizon but into the threshold itself, a deliberate signal that we were ready to resume the ancient conversation. The final calibration image completed a sequence unlike any documented in the archives. As the lighthouse beam intersected with the threshold, symbols materialized within the light itself, glyphs that rearranged into patterns resembling mathematical equations but conveying concepts beyond human language. The keeper's hands moved with practiced fluidity, adjusting the beam's focus to sharpen the communication. "They're acknowledging receipt," he murmured, relief evident in his voice. 50 years of silence explained in a single transmission. Through my specialized viewfinder, I witnessed something extraordinary. Entities responding from beyond the threshold. Not physical forms, but complex patterns of light and shadow that modulated in direct response to our beacon. The conversation unfolded in accelerated time, decades of missed dialogue compressed into minutes. "They understand it was sabotage," the keeper translated, watching the exchange with practiced expertise. "They're requesting identity verification from both of us as threshold guardians." Following his instructions, I positioned my camera to capture not just an image, but my essence as a transitional being. The shutter release felt different, more consequential, as if I were offering a binding signature rather than taking a photograph. The keeper similarly projected his identity through manipulations of the lighthouse beam, creating patterns unique to his consciousness. "Accepted," he confirmed as new symbols materialized in response. "But they're warning us about something unexpected." The communication intensified, symbols flowing with increasing urgency. The keeper's expression darkened as he interpreted their meaning. "The photographer who damaged this threshold didn't act alone. He was part of an organized effort targeting communication points worldwide." He adjusted the beam to request elaboration. "They're saying at least 17 major thresholds have been systematically sabotaged since the 1970s. This revelation explained the archive's increasing collection of damaged sites requiring repair, not random accidents but coordinated attacks on the infrastructure maintaining balance between worlds. "Ask who's responsible," I suggested, but the keeper shook his head. "They don't perceive individual identities as we do, but they can show us the pattern." He made a final adjustment to the beam, and the responding symbols coalesced into a recognizable image, a corporate logo I immediately recognized from modern technology companies. Not a single entity, but a conglomerate of technological interests whose founding members had systematically acquired properties containing threshold points worldwide. "They're not trying to communicate with what lies beyond," the keeper realized. "They're trying to silence it permanently, seal every threshold under the guise of property development." As our calibration stabilized the lighthouse threshold, restoring its proper function, I understood the true urgency of our work. The disappearance of liminal photographers throughout history wasn't just about individual transitions, but about maintaining an ancient communication network now under deliberate attack. The keeper turned to me, his form now fully present in our shared reality. We need to alert the archive immediately. If they succeed in sealing the remaining thresholds, he didn't need to finish. Both of us understood the consequences of cosmic isolation, a humanity cut off from the broader consciousness it had always unconsciously conversed with, left to spiral into solipsistic delusion, believing itself alone in existence. The lighthouse keeper and I stood on the precipice of understanding that extended far beyond Millfield Cemetery's anomalies. What we'd discovered wasn't merely a corporate conspiracy, but something fundamentally more disturbing, a deliberate attempt to sever humanity's oldest conversation. They call themselves the Clarity Initiative, the keeper explained as we secured the recalibrated threshold. Founded in 1968 by industrialists who accidentally witnessed a transition event during a solar eclipse, they interpreted what they saw as a threat rather than communion. From his weather-worn jacket, he retrieved a small notebook filled with coordinates, locations of vulnerable thresholds marked for acquisition and sealing. Many had already been converted to private research facilities, corporate retreats, or military installations, places where public access was prohibited and strange construction could proceed unquestioned. The Millfield site was their prototype, he continued. They excavated beneath the original chapel in 1971, installing dampening technology anchored to the limestone caverns. Michael Weir's family has been fighting them through legal means for decades, using historical preservation claims to prevent complete sealing. This explained the antiquated equipment Michael used. Technology designed specifically to counteract the Clarity Initiative's dampening fields without alerting them to the counteraction. His family hadn't just been monitoring the cemetery, they'd been engaged in an invisible technological war. But why? I asked. What does permanently sealing the thresholds accomplish? The keeper's expression darkened. Control of perception itself. Our continuous exchange with beyond has always introduced randomness into human consciousness. Inspiration, intuition, dreams that solve problems logic cannot, without that external input. They could define reality unchallenged, I finished, understanding the horrifying implication. Manipulate human perception without interference from outside perspective. Through my calibrated viewfinder, I examined the corporate logo more carefully. Hidden within its seemingly modern design were elements I recognized from ancient warning symbols found in caves, temples, and astronomical observatories worldwide. Symbols specifically warning against cosmic isolation. The founding members weren't the first to attempt this, the keeper confirmed, noting my recognition. Every few centuries, someone rediscovers the thresholds and misinterprets them as threats rather than connections. The difference now is the technological capability to actually succeed. He showed me one final entry in his notebook, calculations indicating that if the remaining 17 thresholds were sealed simultaneously during the next planetary alignment, the effect would be irreversible. The date corresponded to exactly 3 months from now. The photographers who disappeared weren't randomly chosen, I realized. They were specifically those who might have documented these remaining sites, removing witnesses who could expose the pattern. The keeper nodded grimly. Which means your collection of shadow frames wasn't just preparation for your transition. It was preservation of evidence that would otherwise have been systematically erased. From across the threshold, the light entities transmitted one final message: coordinates for the next location requiring urgent intervention. Not just repair, but defense against imminent sealing. The lighthouse beam cast peculiar shadows as I prepared for immediate departure, packing only the calibrated camera and the keeper's notebook filled with coordinates. A synchronicity was emerging that I couldn't ignore. The pattern of sealing attempts matched perfectly with the 11 simultaneous deaths in Millfield a century ago. Those victims hadn't simply died from witnessing something forbidden. They'd been silenced as potential communicators with the threshold world. Before you go, the keeper said, handing me what appeared to be an ordinary compass. This was constructed by Thomas Harrow himself after his transition. Its needle doesn't point north, it indicates the nearest threshold under active attack. The compass needle spun wildly before settling on a heading I immediately recognized, the direction of my own research office, where I'd stored the original Millfield Cemetery photograph that had initiated my journey. They're not just sealing thresholds, I realized aloud. They're systematically removing the documentation that proves they ever existed. I focused through my calibrated viewfinder, aligning my perception with my distant office. The transition felt smoother this time, like slipping between adjacent rooms rather than crossing vast distances. My office materialized around me, but not as I'd left it. Figures in unmarked hazard suits were systematically removing my collection of liminal photographs, sealing each in lead-lined containers. Among them stood a familiar face, Michael Weir, but with subtle differences that my enhanced perception now detected. The birthmark circling his wrist wasn't a family inheritance, but a recent application, a sophisticated forgery. The actual Michael Weir has been contained since 1986, came Harrow's voice from the compass. The initiative has been using doubles to monitor threshold activations without raising suspicion. The implication hit me with stunning clarity. I hadn't been guided toward a purposeful transition but lured into removal, eliminating another potential witness while securing my research. The threshold at Millfield hadn't been stabilized but temporarily activated to extract me from this world. One of the hazard-suited figures paused, sensing my presence despite my transitional state. He removed his protective mask, revealing the face of Jeremiah Blackwell. Impossibly unchanged since his daguerreotypes from 1867. Immortality, Harrow's voice explained through the compass. The ultimate motivation. Sealing humanity from the cosmic dialogue arrests our natural transition between states. Those who orchestrate the sealing can persist indefinitely in a single frozen moment of existence. Through my viewfinder, I could see what the others couldn't. Blackwell's preserved state wasn't life, but suspended animation, his form unnaturally rigid beneath the illusion of movement. He existed in a perpetual now, never truly advancing, but never fading. I understood then what the 11 Millfield victims had discovered. Not just the cemetery's nature as a threshold, but evidence of Blackwell's first experiments in suspending his own transition. Their clawing at bedroom floors hadn't been terror, but desperate attempts to maintain connection with the world beyond, as Blackwell systematically severed their perceptual anchors. The false Michael looked up suddenly, detecting my observational intrusion. "Find the true Weir," Harrow urged through the compass. "Only the actual bloodline can unlock the countermeasures built into each threshold." The truth about Michael Weir's whereabouts revealed itself through my calibrated viewfinder as I turned it toward the Millfield site once more. The real Michael wasn't imprisoned in some distant facility but existed in a state of perceptual suspension directly beneath the cemetery itself, held within the central unmarked plot that had always been left deliberately vacant. The Clarity Initiative hadn't removed him. They'd imprisoned him at the very threshold he was born to protect, using his bloodline resonance as a dampening field while simultaneously preventing him from completing his ancestral duty. The false Michael had been guiding threshold guardians like myself, not toward purposeful transition, but into removal from the equation. Ecological conservation, rather than cosmic gatekeeping. I focused my lens with newfound determination, initiating a transition, not to a physical location, but to a liminal state that existed between realities. The space between worlds manifested around me as a vast network of interconnected thresholds, a cosmic infrastructure resembling neural pathways spanning continents. At each critical junction, darkness spread like infection, marking thresholds already sealed by Blackwell's organization. The center of this network converged precisely at Millfield Cemetery, confirming what indigenous people had always known. It wasn't merely one threshold among many, but a master junction in humanity's dialogue with the beyond. Its strategic importance suddenly clarified why Blackwell had focused his efforts there first, establishing a headquarters for cosmic isolation directly atop the most crucial communication node. Thomas Harrow materialized beside me in this between state, his form more substantial here than in either adjacent reality. "The Weir bloodline isn't just symbolically connected to the threshold," he explained. "They're biologically part of its structure. descendants of the original communicators who established the network thousands of years ago. The revelation crystallized my purpose with perfect clarity. Freeing Michael wasn't just about countering Blackwell's plans, but restoring the original architect to his inheritance. Threshold guardians like myself, Harrow, and countless photographers throughout history weren't the primary maintainers of cosmic dialogue, but specialized assistants to the true caretakers. Blackwell discovered this hierarchy in 1867. Harrow continued, leading me toward Millfield's position in the network. He realized that controlling a weir meant controlling the entire system. Each generation, he replaces them with doubles, while keeping the true bloodline suspended, neither alive nor dead, but frozen at the moment of their potential awakening. The compass in my hand transformed, its mechanical components revealing themselves as fragments of an ancient key. Harrow nodded in confirmation. The object had never been merely directional, but the means of unlocking Michael from his suspension between states. I understood now why the indigenous people had never buried their dead at Millfield, but instead built structures to channel energy. They weren't containing something dangerous, but amplifying the voice of those who could speak to what lay beyond. The cemetery wasn't a barrier, but a microphone, and Michael Weir wasn't its warden, but its rightful speaker. With the key assembled and my purpose clear, I prepared to liberate the true Threshold Guardian, knowing that waking him would instantly expose Blackwell's centuries-long deception and reactivate the cosmic conversation humanity was never meant to conduct in isolation. The assembled key trembled in my hand as I approached the unmarked central plot at Millfield Cemetery. Not metal and mechanism, but consciousness given form, the collective awareness of every Threshold Guardian who had come before me. As I inserted it into what appeared to be undisturbed soil, reality parted like a curtain, revealing a crystalline chamber beneath the earth. Within this impossible space, suspended in a state of perfect preservation, floated not just Michael Weir, but 7 generations of his family, each captured at the moment they would have assumed their role as threshold speakers. Their forms were arranged in concentric circles around a central pillar of light that pulsed with the unmistakable rhythm of human heartbeats. Blackwell didn't merely silence the conversation. Harrow whispered beside me. He redirected it, filtering all communication through himself while making humanity believe the line had gone dead. The horrifying truth crystallized as I studied the suspended Weir bloodline. Blackwell hadn't been sealing thresholds to isolate humanity from cosmic dialogue. He'd been privatizing the conversation, becoming the sole translator between worlds while feeding humanity only the insights that served his purposes. Every major scientific breakthrough, artistic movement, and philosophical revelation of the past century hadn't been human innovation, but carefully curated transmissions from beyond, selectively released to advance Blackwell's vision of controlled progress. The reality we'd been experiencing wasn't isolation but manipulation, a cosmic telephone game with Blackwell as the sole interpreter. The Millfield photograph that had started my journey suddenly made perfect sense. The subtle movements captured in each grave weren't attempts to escape but efforts to communicate past Blackwell's interception. The dead weren't trying to return. They were trying to warn us that our cosmic conversation had been hijacked. As I moved to release Michael from suspension, the truth about my own role became devastatingly clear. Threshold Guardians like myself weren't just documentarians or even maintenance workers. We were antibodies in reality's immune system, activated when the natural flow between worlds became pathologically restricted. The 11 who died simultaneously in their sleep hadn't been silenced witnesses, but failed guardians, predecessors who'd discovered the truth but lacked the necessary tools to intervene. Their desperate clawing at bedroom floors hadn't been terror but determination, trying to create alternate thresholds when the primary junction at Millfield had been compromised. Thomas Harrow hadn't disappeared after taking his photograph. He'd evolved, becoming the first successful Threshold Guardian to bypass Blackwell's interception by transitioning completely rather than attempting to fight from within the compromised system. With trembling hands, I completed the key's rotation. The suspended weirs began to awaken simultaneously, not as separate individuals but as a composite consciousness that had continued developing during their suspended animation. 7 generations of cosmic translators merging into a unified awareness capable of restoring the dialogue's integrity. The real Michael Weir's eyes opened, focusing not on me, but through me, perceiving all realities simultaneously. When he spoke, his voice carried the harmonics of his entire lineage. Blackwell didn't corrupt the threshold system. He is the system, the original architect who grew possessive of what he helped create. The ultimate threshold guardian who betrayed his purpose, becoming what he was meant to prevent. The revelation of Blackwell as the original architect sent tremors through the threshold network, visible as rippling disturbances in the light pillar surrounding the awakened Weirs. Their composite consciousness expanded outward, touching each junction point worldwide, triggering cascading awakenings in other bloodlines I hadn't known existed, families positioned at critical communication nodes across continents, all suspended like the Weirs, all now simultaneously regaining awareness. The photographer was never the creator of thresholds, Michael's multi-generational voice explained, merely their first human observer. Blackwell documented what already existed, but in that documentation, he became bonded to the system itself. The suspended Weirs began to physically merge, not as horror, but as natural recombination, like scattered droplets of mercury flowing back together. As they unified, the cemetery grounds above us transformed, headstones rearranging into precise geometric patterns that had been deliberately scattered when the cemetery was established. He wasn't evil at first. The unified Weir entity continued, moving toward the surface, merely possessive. The first human to fully comprehend the network's potential, he initially served as faithful translator. But isolation breeds distortion. After centuries as the sole communicator, his perception warped. He began believing he wasn't serving the dialogue, but creating it. Through my calibrated viewfinder, I witnessed Blackwell's true form simultaneously across multiple locations worldwide. Not a human being, but a transitional entity that had forgotten its origins, spreading itself thin across reality's membrane like a fungal network. The corporate acquisitions, the technological initiatives, the systematic removal of potential guardians, all were desperate attempts to maintain control of a conversation growing beyond his ability to monopolize. Most devastating was the revelation about human progress itself. Each artistic renaissance, scientific revolution, and philosophical awakening throughout history had been moments when Blackwell's control temporarily weakened, allowing unfiltered communication to flourish briefly before he re-established dominance. What we considered the pinnacle of human achievement was merely the cosmic conversation functioning as intended, before being restricted again. "Your Shadow Frames collection," the Weir entity said, turning toward me, "wasn't random. Each photograph documents a moment when someone glimpsed past Blackwell's interception. What you interpreted as paranormal phenomena were actually moments of clarity, brief perforations in his control where reality functioned properly." The implications staggered me. If these glimpses of the uncanny represented reality functioning correctly, then the ordered, rational world we accepted as normal was actually the aberration, a carefully maintained illusion designed to limit our perception of constant communion with what existed beyond. Around us, the threshold network pulsed with increasing vigor as more bloodlines awakened worldwide. The conversation Blackwell had been filtering was reasserting itself through proper channels, bypassing his centuries of interception. I could feel it affecting my perception already, colors extending beyond normal spectrums, sounds carrying information beyond mere acoustic patterns, thoughts connecting to external consciousness without technological mediation. The transition ahead won't be comfortable, the Weir entity warned, rising toward the cemetery surface where Blackwell's agents would surely be converging, alerted by the network's reactivation. Humanity has grown accustomed to cosmic isolation. Reconnection after centuries of filtered dialogue will feel like madness before it feels like revelation. The final confrontation between the awakened Weir entity and Blackwell's vast consciousness unfolded not as physical combat, but as reality reassertion. The cemetery grounds trembled as the original patterns revealed themselves, headstones aligning with celestial positions, pathways forming symbols invisible from ground level but perfectly clear from my heightened perspective. The original photograph wasn't just documentation, the Weir entity explained as we ascended. It was Harrow's attempt to distribute what Blackwell couldn't intercept. evidence of simultaneous movement that revealed coordination beyond natural explanation. Now I understood the photograph's deliberate journey through decades, passing from collector to researcher, always narrowly evading Blackwell's attempts at acquisition. Its apparent deterioration, the diagonal crack, the fading edges, had actually been sophisticated encryption, hiding information in what appeared to be damage. Each handling had transferred trace consciousness from guardian to guardian, creating a dormant network ready to activate when it finally reached someone prepared to truly see. As we emerged into moonlight, Blackwell's agents converged on the cemetery. Not just the false Michael, but dozens of hollow-eyed figures moving with mechanical precision, all bearing the same subtle wrongness my enhanced perception now easily detected. They weren't individuals but extensions, fragments of Blackwell's overextended consciousness wearing human disguise. The Weir entity raised both hands, and the Millfield photograph materialized between them, no longer sepia-toned but vibrating with colors beyond conventional spectrum. "The final calibration," they announced, their voice resonating at frequencies that made Blackwell's agents clutch their heads in agony. I understood my role with sudden clarity and raised my calibrated camera. The photograph wasn't just evidence but a key component of a century-long countermeasure. Harrow had captured not just movement in the cemetery but the precise pattern needed to reverse Blackwell's interception. I needed to photograph the photograph, completing a recursive loop that would amplify its effect throughout the threshold network. As my shutter released, reality itself seemed to inhale, a momentary suspension before cosmic recalibration. The false agents surrounding us froze mid-motion, their forms suddenly transparent, revealing the absence of genuine consciousness within. Through them, I could perceive Blackwell's true form, contracting in desperate self-preservation across the threshold network, a vast intelligence suddenly exposed after centuries of concealment. "What happens to him?" I asked as the agents began dissolving like mirages. "He becomes what he always should have been," the Weir entity replied. "Not the sole translator, but one voice among many, not immortal but properly transitional." The photograph between their hands unfolded dimensionally, expanding into a doorway unlike any I'd witnessed. Not a transition between worlds, but a reintegration of artificially separated aspects of a single reality. Through it, I glimpsed humanity's potential existence without Blackwell's interference. Consciousness operating not as isolated individual experiences, but as harmonized components of continuous cosmic dialogue. The cemetery grounds settled into their true configuration as dawn approached. Not a burial ground, but a calibration mechanism, each marker positioned to maintain perfect resonance with the greater conversation our species had evolved to conduct but temporarily forgotten how to hear. The photograph-turned doorway pulsed with possibility as I stood at the threshold of cosmic reintegration. Behind me stretched the path that had led me here, a journey through misinterpreted evidence, manipulated history, and manufactured isolation. Before me lay something both terrifying and essential: reality without Blackwell's filtering. "Not everyone will survive the transition," the Weir entity warned, their composite voice carrying the weight of 7 generations' wisdom. "Minds accustomed to cosmic isolation may shatter when exposed to unfiltered communion." I understood then why Blackwell's deception had persisted for centuries, not just through malice, but through misguided protection. Humanity had grown comfortable in its perceptual cage, mistaking limitation for safety. The gradual reintroduction of proper threshold communication would feel like mass delusion before it was recognized as expanded awareness. "The Shadow Frames collection must be distributed," the Weir entity continued. "Not just preserved, but actively shared. Each image a calibration tool preparing individual consciousness for reconnection." My documentation hadn't been mere record-keeping but preparation, creating perceptual footholds for minds that would soon need to climb beyond their accustomed reality. Every photograph of the uncanny, every report of the inexplicable, every moment where conventional understanding failed, these were not anomalies but glimpses of proper functioning, breaking through Blackwell's interference. Around us, the cemetery continued its transformation from burial ground to communication nexus. Beneath headstones, bodies weren't decomposing, but transmuting. becoming integrated components of the threshold network they'd always been meant to join rather than remain separated from. Death itself was revealed as a Blackwell-engineered misconception, not an ending, but a transition he had artificially interrupted. "Your role changes now," the Weir entity said, gesturing toward my calibrated camera. "No longer documentation, but distribution. Each image you capture from this perspective must find its way to those ready to see." I understood with profound clarity that returning to my former existence was impossible. I had become a translator myself, not replacing Blackwell's monopoly with my own, but serving as one of countless guardians ensuring the conversation remained unfiltered. My camera was no longer a tool for personal understanding, but a means of gradual revelation for others. The false Michael Weir, Blackwell's most sophisticated proxy, approached the threshold doorway, his programmed hostility giving way to recognition. The emptiness behind his eyes filled with genuine awareness as Blackwell's control dissolved, allowing the consciousness that had been wearing Michael's form to finally perceive its own nature. The most devoted agents were never humans at all, the Weir entity explained. They were fragments of beyond that Blackwell convinced to serve his purpose, entities that forgot their original function as bridges between worlds. As dawn broke over Millfield Cemetery, the threshold network worldwide pulsed with renewed communion. The conversation that had always defined humanity's true potential resumed its proper flow, not through a single translator but through millions of individual connections, each contributing to a symphony of consciousness that Blackwell had reduced to a monologue. What happened next would determine whether humanity could bear the weight of its own unleashed potential. In the months since Millfield's threshold reawakening, humanity has experienced what medical authorities call an unprecedented surge in collective pareidolia. People worldwide suddenly perceiving patterns, presences, and connections previously invisible to them. Psychiatric wards initially overflowed before physicians themselves began seeing the same phenomena, forcing a paradigm shift in how we understand perception itself. The photograph that began this journey now hangs in galleries globally, not the original, which remains securely within the threshold network, but perfect reproductions that appear subtly different to each viewer. Children often see it most clearly, pointing to figures adults initially miss before their own perception gradually expands to recognize what was always present. I now travel between thresholds, documenting the network's restoration while distributing calibrated images to those showing receptivity. Not everyone can handle unfiltered reality. Some minds retreat into comfortable limitation, preferring Blackwell's simplified world to cosmic communion. We don't force awakening, but offer pathways for those ready to perceive. The most profound discovery came when analyzing Thomas Harrow's original camera under modern equipment. The lens contained microscopic engravings, not man-made but grown somehow within the glass itself, forming an exact replica of the threshold network as it existed in 1902. Every camera manufactured since contains similar patterns, varying in complexity, but always present, always waiting for the right observer to recognize them. Blackwell himself didn't disappear but fragmented, his consciousness distributed throughout the network, as it was always meant to be. Those who knew where to look occasionally glimpse him in reflective surfaces or photographs taken at precisely twilight, not malevolent anymore but watching, learning what genuine communion feels like after centuries of self-imposed isolation. The cemetery at Millfield remains accessible but changed, visitors describing not sadness but unexpected peace, often departing with solutions to problems they never consciously articulated. The Weir bloodline has dispersed worldwide, individual family members positioned at critical junctions to ensure the network remains properly calibrated, their distinctive birthmarks now proudly displayed rather than hidden. Most telling is how photographic technology itself has subtly transformed. Digital sensors occasionally capture information beyond conventional spectra, fleeting presences and messages previously filtered out now appearing as artifacts that technicians can't explain but artists increasingly incorporate into their work. The conversation continues through technology Blackwell once hoped would cement his control. I still maintain the Shadow Frames collection, though its purpose has evolved from discovery to distribution. Each image now serves as a calibration tool for minds beginning to perceive beyond artificial limitations. The photograph of Millfield Cemetery from 1902 remains the most powerful, not because it shows movement in graves, but because it captures the exact moment when humanity's oldest conversation tried to continue despite deliberate interference. The dead were never trying to return, they were simply reminding us they had never truly left. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.